Europe thought it was prepared, but nothing could have warned them. Entire nations fell in a matter of days. Cities vanished, families disappeared, and borders were erased almost overnight. The world would soon learn that this was not just another war, it was a war that aimed to erase entire peoples. Hidden horrors, secret strategies, and betrayals among allies would shatter everything Europe knew about safety, loyalty, and survival. And in the heart of this chaos, ordinary civilians would witness things so unimaginable that even decades later, their stories would still shock the world. In the early hours of September 1939, Europe was unaware that it was standing at the edge of its darkest chapter. Cities slept under quiet skies, borders looked permanent, and people clung to hope, even as tensions simmered beneath the surface. Across the continent, political extremes were rising, fueled by economic despair and the memories of the First World War. Nations were preparing quietly, armies reorganizing, yet the ordinary citizens continued their daily lives, oblivious to the storm approaching. Within days, the world they knew would shatter, and the continent would burn in a conflict that no one could escape. This was not the story of a single country or a single leader, it was the story of Europe itself. By the late 1930s, Germany had become a nation seeking revenge for the humiliations of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler's rise to power was rapid, and the propaganda machine painted a vision of restored greatness. Meanwhile, Italy under Mussolini dreamed of empires reborn, and Spain struggled through a civil war that foreshadowed a continent-wide upheaval. In Eastern Europe, fear and uncertainty dominated daily life as nations braced for the ambitions of larger powers. Across every border, ordinary people lived in quiet anxiety, sensing that the fragile peace they had inherited from the previous war was fragile, perhaps impossible to maintain. On September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland, unleashing a level of mechanized warfare Europe had never seen. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, struck with terrifying speed, combining tanks, airplanes, and infantry. In a deadly dance of precision and destruction, cities were bombed from above, railways cut off, and Polish soldiers fought desperately against an enemy they could not hope to outmatch. Within weeks, Poland fell, and Europe realized that no nation was safe. The world watched as a small country was crushed in a matter of days, signaling that the continent was entering a war that would engulf millions. As the war spread, France and Britain declared war on Germany. But the early months brought only uneasy waiting and preparation. Soldiers trained in muddy fields, factories churned out weapons, and civilians braced for the inevitable. In 1940, Germany launched a massive invasion of Western Europe, bypassing the heavily defended Maginot Line. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg fell in rapid succession, followed by France, which was occupied in just 6 weeks. The speed of the conquest stunned the world and left millions of Europeans under foreign control, facing uncertainty and fear in their own homes. Life under occupation varied, but everywhere it brought fear and deprivation. In France, citizens witnessed the rise of collaborationist governments, while resistance movements quietly formed in cities and forests. In the Netherlands and Belgium, curfews and strict rationing reshaped daily life. In Eastern Europe, the situation was even more brutal, as Nazi ideology sought not only control but the complete annihilation of entire communities. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed, and countless lives extinguished in ways that would haunt Europe for decades. The shadow of war was everywhere, touching every street, every village, every heart. The war also brought the rise of new military technology that changed the nature of combat. Tanks rolled across fields at unprecedented speeds, aircraft dominated the skies, and submarines threatened the very lifelines of nations. Cities became targets, and civilians increasingly found themselves in the crossfire. Bombing campaigns over London, Berlin, and other major cities left scars that went far beyond the physical destruction. Entire populations were forced to adapt to air raids, shortages, and the constant threat of violence, learning to survive in a world that had become unrecognizable. The Eastern Front became the deadliest theater of all, where the conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union unleashed unimaginable suffering. Millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in battles of staggering scale. Cities like Stalingrad became symbols of endurance and horror, with brutal winter conditions, starvation, and relentless fighting claiming countless lives. Entire communities were uprooted, and the lines between military and civilian targets blurred. Europe witnessed some of its most horrifying human tragedies in these years, and the consequences would echo for generations. Meanwhile, in occupied countries, resistance movements grew stronger, fueled by courage, desperation, and the hope of liberation. Partisans in France, Poland, and Yugoslavia risked everything to sabotage supply lines, gather intelligence, and protect innocent lives. These ordinary men and women, often civilians with no formal training, became unsung heroes, striking back against the machinery of war. Their actions reminded Europe that even in the darkest times, courage could persist, and the fight for freedom was never entirely lost. By 1944, the tides of war began to turn. The Allies launched the D-Day invasion in Normandy, a massive and meticulously planned operation that marked the beginning of Germany's retreat in Western Europe. Thousands of soldiers stormed the beaches under intense fire, and the courage displayed in those moments would be remembered for generations. From Paris to the Rhine, liberation came slowly but steadily, bringing hope to a continent that had endured unimaginable suffering. Yet even as some regions rejoiced, others continued to endure conflict and devastation, reminding all that victory came at an enormous cost. The final months of the war brought both liberation and reckoning. Concentration camps were discovered, revealing the scale of human cruelty inflicted by the Nazi regime. Entire communities that had been hidden from the world were laid bare, and Europe confronted a truth too terrible to ignore. Survivors told their stories, and the world watched as the full scope of the Holocaust emerged. The war had ended, but Europe was left with wounds that no treaty could erase, scars that would define the continent for decades to come. In the aftermath, Europe began the long process of rebuilding. Cities were reconstructed, economies slowly recovered, and survivors tried to reclaim their lives. Borders were redrawn, new governments formed, and the continent entered a period of reflection and remembrance. The lessons of the war, both its horrors and the courage it inspired, shaped Europe's future. From the ashes, nations found a fragile peace, yet the memories of the burning years remained, reminding all who lived through them, and those who came after, of what was lost and what had been endured. World War II in Europe was more than battles, treaties, and borders. It was a test of humanity itself. Ordinary people endured extraordinary suffering, and extraordinary courage emerged in the most unlikely places, from the streets of Warsaw to the beaches of Normandy, from the forests of Yugoslavia to the cities of France. Europe was forever transformed. Millions de millions survived, and millions more carried the weight of those years in silence. The story of Europe burning is a story of tragedy, endurance, and ultimately, the hope that even in the darkest times, humanity can endure.